Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the place where we stand shoulder to shoulder with those who faced walls meant to keep them out and walked through them anyway. Tonight we gather not around kings or tyrants, but around two ordinary students who faced the weight of centuries on their shoulders and refused to bow. This is the story of a door that would not open until two young black students stepped forward and forced it to, with the eyes of the world watching. Tonight, we step into Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in the sweltering summer of 1963 to walk beside Vivian Malone and James Hood. Two names that may not be shouted in the streets like Martin or Malcolm, but who walked through the schoolhouse door and cracked segregation's iron grip at the University of Alabama forever. Sit back, pour yourself something warm, and come with me to a place where courage walked on young legs and history turned because two students showed up for class. Before the world knew their names, before they were written into court documents and photographed pushing past a governor's sneer, Vivian Malone and James Hood were simply two children learning to read the world in a language written by segregation's cruel hand. Vivian Juanita Malone was born on July 15, 1942, in Mobile, Alabama, a port city resting on the edge of the Gulf Coast. Mobile was no stranger to the contradictions of the American South, a place where grand oak trees draped in Spanish moss shaded homes built by hands that once labored in bondage. By the 1940s, Jim Crow's signs were as common as church steeples and sweet tea, separate waiting rooms, separate schools, separate dreams. Vivian's parents, Willie and Bertie Malone, believed fiercely that knowledge was armor and education, freedom. They were not wealthy, but their children's minds were a treasure chest they refused to leave unopened. Her father, disciplined and precise, worked long hours with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, one of the few federal jobs open to black men at the time. Her mother, Bertie, ran the household like a general runs a battalion, orderly, purposeful, quietly radical in the way she insisted her children stand tall and speak clearly. Vivian's older siblings were the vanguard, every child finishing high school, many pushing further when they could. She was raised to see the chalkboard and the library as her rightful territory, even as Alabama's white leaders used every law and threat to say otherwise. She was bright, a natural student. Her teachers at Central High School in Mobile, one of the all-black schools left over from Plessy v. Ferguson's cruel separate but equal lie, saw a spark that could not be smothered by ragged textbooks or underfunded classrooms. Vivian thrived, graduated near the top of her class, and went on to Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University, a historically black college that nourished minds left out of the white schools up the road. But when Vivian looked beyond the fence line of that safe haven, she saw that the doors she truly wanted were still locked. Accounting, business administration, courses that would lift her into a profession dominated by white men who'd never sat next to a black woman in class. And so the question that shaped her childhood became her rebellion. Why not me? James Alexander Hood drew his first breath that same year, 1942, in Gadsden, Alabama, a smaller city, hemmed by iron mills and stubborn racial lines. Gadsden was not the urban swirl of Mobile. It was a place where everyone knew who belonged where, and what happened if you forgot your place. James was raised in a modest home by parents who, like the Malones, knew the tightrope walk of dignity under Jim Crow. For black families, education wasn't just hope, it was survival. If you could read, you could protect yourself. If you could speak well, you might make a white boss pause before cheating you out of wages. And if you could dream big enough, you might slip through the cracks in the walls the South built to pen you in. James was quiet, not shy, but deliberate. A boy who watched carefully, who knew when to speak and when to listen. His teachers at Carver High School, another all-black institution named after George Washington Carver, to remind students that greatness could bloom even in segregation's stony soil, nurtured his mind and spirit. He left Gadsden to attend Clark College in Atlanta, another historically black school that produced generations of teachers, preachers, lawyers, and activists. But like Vivian, James saw that the real battleground was not the colleges that welcomed him, but the ones that barred him by force of law and tradition. The South of Vivian and James's childhoods was a land of hymns and humiliations. They drank from fountains marked colored, sat in the back pews of city buses, watched movies from balcony seats because the main floor was white-only territory. They knew the fear in their parents' eyes when the sheriff's car slowed in front of their homes at night. They knew the risk that any act of defiance, spoken too loud, acted too boldly, could mean a beating or worse. Yet within those same walls, Black families taught a different lesson. One day, you will stand up, you will speak back, and when that day comes, you must stand steady. By the time Vivian and James came of age, the winds were shifting. Brown v. Board of Education had cracked the lie of separate but equal in 1954, but Alabama's iron grip refused to budge. They watched Rosa Parks refuse to stand on a bus just an hour's drive away in Montgomery. They heard of the Freedom Riders battered on back roads and in burning buses. They knew that sometimes you did not have to pick up a weapon to fight. You only had to sit down where they said you could not. Vivian and James were not chosen by accident, nor were they simply pawns pushed forward by lawyers and movement leaders. They stepped forward of their own will, their families standing behind them, ready to endure the storms that history promised them. In a world that told them, "You can't," they answered with 2 words written in the notebooks they carried to class: "Watch me." By the time Vivian Malone and James Hood were ready to test the walls of the University of Alabama, the battle for desegregation in America's schools was nearly a decade old and soaked in sacrifice. The promise of Brown and the Southern defiance. In 1954, the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared what Black parents and teachers already knew. Separate but equal was a lie dressed up as law. Schools divided by race could never be equal. And yet, even with the Supreme Court's word on paper, the reality on Alabama's red clay soil did not budge. Southern states found every trick in the segregationist playbook to delay, dodge, and defy the law. Massive resistance became their rallying cry. White citizens' councils formed, polite-sounding clubs where lawyers, businessmen, and city officials plotted how to keep schools closed rather than integrate a single classroom. And standing at the head of that defiance in Alabama was a man named George Wallace. George Wallace hadn't always been a fire-breathing segregationist. Earlier in his career, he was known as a moderate judge who actually treated Black lawyers with basic respect, rare for a white politician in Alabama then. But ambition is a ruthless teacher. When Wallace lost his first race for governor in 1958 to a candidate backed by the Ku Klux Klan, he vowed never to be out-niggered again, as he crudely put it. By 1962, he was Governor Wallace, sworn in on a freezing January day under Alabama's marble dome, declaring with venom what the old guard wanted to hear: segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. When the courts forced the University of Alabama to admit Black students, Wallace saw his moment to stand not just as governor, but as the living symbol of white resistance. Vivian and James apply. Behind the drama, 2 young people did the simplest thing. They applied. Vivian Malone wanted to study commerce and accounting, James Hood, social sciences. The University of Alabama rejected them as a matter of routine. But the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, the same team that argued Brown, had not spent 10 years fighting segregation to stop at a rejection letter. Their legal team, led by the indomitable Thurgood Marshall's successors, pressed the courts. They forced the university's hand. In 1963, a federal district judge ordered the university to enroll Vivian and James. There would be no more excuses, no more tricks. The stand in the schoolhouse door, but George Wallace made his move. He promised the people who elected him that he would personally block the door rather than allow integration. He knew the cameras would be there. He wanted them. He wanted the world to see him as the South's last line of defense. June 11th, 1963, a humid day in Tuscaloosa. Reporters from around the world gathered outside Foster Auditorium, waiting for the confrontation that would decide whether Alabama would yield to the Constitution or tear itself apart fighting it. Vivian Malone wore a simple dress and pearls, as if going to Sunday church. James Hood carried himself with quiet calm. Both knew they were stepping into history's spotlight and into danger. They were not naive. Death threats had come in by the handful. Crosses had burned before for less, but they walked on. Meanwhile, President John F. Kennedy, watching from the White House, could not afford another embarrassment. Earlier that year, Governor Wallace's defiance had inspired violence in Birmingham, where water hoses and police dogs were unleashed on peaceful marchers. The world watched. The shame was global. This time, Kennedy ordered Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach to accompany the students personally. Behind him waited U.S. Marshals and the Alabama National Guard, federalized by Kennedy to ensure Wallace would not win. The standoff. On the steps of Foster Auditorium, Wallace stood with state troopers at his side. Vivian and James arrived in a motorcade, escorted by Katzenbach and a convoy of federal men in dark suits and sunglasses. The cameras rolled. The reporters scribbled every word. Wallace, in his tailored suit and a tight smile, delivered his tired speech about states' rights, the old code for keeping black students out. Katzenbach read the court order, step aside or be removed. Wallace refused. The motorcade left, but only to regroup. While Wallace basked in the spectacle, President Kennedy signed an executive order placing the Alabama National Guard under federal control. Suddenly, the same soldiers Wallace thought would protect segregation now reported to the President of the United States. When the motorcade returned, General Henry Futh Graham of the Alabama Guard stepped forward, saluted, and told Wallace to move. Faced with arrest by his own soldiers, Wallace stepped aside, still defiant but powerless. Vivian Malone and James Hood walked past the governor, up the steps, and through the doors that segregation had kept shut for more than a century. No cheering crowd. No riot that day, just the quiet triumph of two students doing what students do, showing up for class. Inside, the battle did not end. They would be harassed, isolated, watched every step of the way. But the symbolic fortress had fallen, and the world had seen the South's Great Wall cracked open by two young people, the courts, and the sheer weight of moral courage. That same night, President Kennedy went on national television. He called for sweeping civil rights legislation. He spoke not of riots or defiance, but of the quiet dignity of students like Vivian and James, who asked only for the same rights white students had always enjoyed. The standoff at the schoolhouse door did not fix America overnight, but it proved that no wall built by hate would stand forever against those willing to walk through it. When the cameras turned away from Tuscaloosa that sweltering June day in 1963, the fight for Vivian Malone and James Hood was far from over. History remembers the photo, the governor in the doorway, the student stepping through, but what came next demanded even more courage than the moment frozen in newsreels. Vivian Malone walked through that doorway and stayed. Day after day, semester after semester, she endured the cold shoulders, the whispered slurs behind her back, the professors who looked through her like she wasn't even there. Imagine, if you will, the small cruelties that stacked up, the classmates who refused to share lab tables, the cafeterias where no one would sit beside her, the library desks where books were accidentally pushed off, the mail that threatened her life, the phone calls in the night that promised fire and rope. And yet, she showed up, books in hand, head high. Vivian knew that every test she passed wasn't just for herself, it was for every black student who would come after her. To fail would feed the segregationists' lies. To endure was its own quiet victory. On May 30th, 1965, after 2 years of unrelenting pressure, Vivian Malone crossed the stage at the University of Alabama as its first black graduate, a bachelor's in business management. Her sister, who had driven her to that door on that first day, wept with pride in the crowd. Her family beamed. Alabama, once so determined to keep her out, was forced to stamp her name in its records forever. But Vivian did not stop there. She knew that crossing that stage meant responsibility, to carry the fight beyond her own diploma. She joined the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where she investigated workplace discrimination and enforced voting rights laws in the South. Later, she rose to become Director of Civil Rights and Urban Affairs for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, pushing for environmental justice long before it was a national headline. She married Dr. Walter Jones and became Vivian Malone Jones, a mother, a mentor, a speaker who returned time and again to the same University of Alabama campus that once locked its doors to her. When the university invited her back decades later as an honored guest and commencement speaker, she spoke with grace, reminding students that history is not just about walls that fall, but about what you build once they're gone. Vivian Malone Jones passed away in 2005 at the age of 63 after suffering a stroke. She left this world not just as a student who opened a door, but as a woman who held it open for thousands more to walk through. James Hood's story after Tuscaloosa was more winding. The hostility he faced on campus was intense. Some professors outright refused to teach him. Students jeered him, threatened him. The weight of it became too much to bear. By the end of 1963, Hood withdrew and transferred to Wayne State University in Detroit, where he completed his bachelor's degree in political science. But the story did not end there. Decades later, when the world had changed and Alabama with it, James Hood returned to the University of Alabama in 1995. This time, not as a young man under federal guard, but as a determined middle-aged man finishing what history had interrupted. In 1997, James Hood received his doctorate in interdisciplinary studies, proudly crossing the stage of the same university that once threatened him. He built a quiet life far from cameras and crowds, working as an administrator at Madison Area Technical College in Wisconsin, helping new generations of students, black, white, and every shade between, find their footing in education's promise. He lectured about his experience, but never claimed to be a hero. He knew the real heroics had not been the day he walked through a door, but the lifetime of staying true to why he did it. In an act that speaks to the complexity of history, James returned in 1997 to stand beside George Wallace, the same governor who had blocked his path decades earlier. Wallace, now frail, bound to a wheelchair, and repentant in old age, asked for forgiveness. James Hood forgave him, not because the past was forgotten, but because he understood that history's scars only heal when we choose to stop picking at them. James Hood died quietly in 2013, at 70 years old. His life was never about shouting his name. It was about showing up, doing the hard work, and leaving the door open behind him. It's easy to remember the standoff at Foster Auditorium as the peak of their courage, but what matters just as much is the ordinary daily acts of endurance that followed. Vivian Malone and James Hood didn't just stand up to a governor. They endured the sneers, the isolation, the mental toll. They stayed in the classrooms and proved that a black student could succeed at Alabama's crown jewel. Their legacy lives on each time a student, any student, crosses a campus that was once barred by skin color alone. Every black graduate of the University of Alabama walks through a door Vivian and James cracked open with their presence. Today, Foster Auditorium bears a plaque that marks where they stood. The Schoolhouse door is a symbol not of Wallace's defiance, but of their quiet victory. In 2000, the university renamed an administrative building the Malone Hood Plaza, a living monument reminding every new generation that the fight for equality is never truly finished. It simply waits for the next student, the next worker, the next citizen brave enough to walk through whatever door stands in their way. Why should we remember two students who simply showed up for class? Because what they did reminds us that freedom does not expand by grand speeches alone, but by the ordinary courage of people who decide enough is enough. Vivian and James did not have armies behind them. They did not hold office. They were not backed by wealth or titles. They wielded nothing more than their enrollment papers, their quiet dignity, and a stubborn refusal to turn away. In a world still wrestling with who gets to sit at which table, who gets to speak and be heard, who gets to learn and who gets left behind, their footsteps echo loudly. Their walk through that door is a reminder that access to education is more than books and lectures. It is the right to claim one's full humanity, to say, I belong here, when the world says otherwise. Vivian Malone and James Hood showed how change is often won by the unglamorous, exhausting work of showing up day after day. Even when your classmates won't look you in the eye, when the faculty hopes you'll drop out, when the governor himself tries to slam the door in your face. Today, their story hums in the quiet bravery of first-generation students who are the first in their families to set foot on a college campus. It hums in every young black student who walks down a hallway that once would have turned them away at the gate. It hums in every fight for inclusion, whether by race, gender, disability, or identity, because the lesson is always the same. The walls will fall only if someone pushes through them first. Their courage also reminds us that history is not just the fight to open the door, it's the vigilance to keep it open. The schoolhouse door is still a test for us. Who gets to walk through next? Who do we help over the threshold? Who do we stand beside when the world tries to build new walls under new names? Their names matter because they show us that ordinary people, when moved by principle and armed with stubborn resolve, can bend the arc of history, even when the odds seem impossibly fixed. When we see debates today over whose history gets taught, whose voices get heard, and whose stories matter, we are seeing echoes of the same fight that Vivian and James braved with nothing but their student IDs and their moral backbone. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: the world does not change on its own. It changes when people stand up, walk forward, and refuse to be turned away. Vivian Malone and James Hood matter because they remind us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply the sound of shoes on a marble floor, footsteps steady toward a classroom that says, "We belong, we are here, and we will not turn back." And so we come to the end of tonight's journey, a journey through dusty classrooms and historic doorways, through the heat of Alabama summer and the cold weight of injustice. Vivian Malone and James Hood did not ask for glory. They did not seek to be heroes. They simply sought what every student deserves: the right to learn, to grow, and to claim their place in the story of their own country. Their courage was quiet but unyielding. Their footsteps cracked open doors that many had thought sealed forever. They remind us all, no matter the walls built around us, no matter the voices telling us no, that the simple act of showing up can be the first blow against oppression. Tonight, as we close this chapter of Faces of History, let us carry with us the legacy of two students who stood firm in the face of a nation's stubborn refusal to change. Their story teaches us that progress is not a distant monument carved in marble. It is built one brave step at a time. So when you find yourself standing before a door that seems locked, a barrier that seems too tall, or a voice that tells you to turn back, remember Vivian Malone and James Hood. Remember that change begins with the courage to walk forward, even when the path is uncertain and the world is watching. Thank you for walking with me today, my friends. Keep your hearts open, your minds steady, and never forget that history is alive. It breathes in our choices, our actions, and in the footsteps we leave behind. I am the Duke of New York, and this has been Faces of History. Until next time, stay brave, stay curious, and keep making history.